So thank you everyone so much for joining us today for this conversation on coronavirus. This is a topic that has touched all of our lives in more ways than I think any of us could have anticipated when we shut down the museum in March. As a museum whose mission it is to fuse science, technology, and art and experiences that inspire creativity and innovation in people of all ages and backgrounds, we can't help but point to the countless ways that the current pandemic has illuminated all of the aspects of science and technology in really meaningful ways and inspired creativity and innovation in our own community and across the globe. I've been particularly impressed with the creative approach to pandemic coverage taken by the Tribune, and I'm so grateful to welcome Salt Lake Tribune reporter Andy Larsen today to share with us the latest information on COVID-19 and its spread through Utah. A lifelong Utah resident, Andy graduated from Salt Lake City's Westminster College with a bachelor's degree in mathematics. And while most of us know him for flexing his probability theory skills in the coverage of the Utah Jazz for the Salt Lake Tribune, in today's COVID conversation, Andy Larsen is bringing his math skills to the big questions we all want to know. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for really breaking down all of this very complex material that are incredibly approachable and also very practical. I was also pleased to see coverage that your Tribune stories now come with a guarantee that will allow you to share the latest and greatest data on the virus's impact on us. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that intro. And even though it was like 10% too kind, I thought. So nevertheless, well, I'll move forward. My name is Andy Larsen. I'm with the Salt Lake Tribune. And I basically, I'll actually just go ahead and start my presentation because I think that's going to be the easiest way for me to explain who I am, what I do, and then really get into what you guys care about, which is not me, but the actual information about the coronavirus. Before we continue, can you all see my presentation here? Seems like it. We're getting nods, thumbs ups. Good. Please feel free to interrupt with any questions. You can do that either with just with your voice and unmute yourself, or you can send in a question via the chat, and I'll kind of answer them in the flow of the presentation. I have no problem with that. And of course, this is for you guys with such a small audience. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you guys have and make this particularly interesting to you. So, this is called Beyond 6 Feet, and I really wanted to find out. Since March, I've been asked to dig into the coronavirus. So I want to, during this presentation, I'm going to be covering where we are currently, which is probably what you guys have heard a lot about in the news in the recent last few days, last week or so. I'll run through that pretty quickly. But then I want to cover transmission, how not to get the virus. That's a number one high priority for nearly all of us, right? Testing, how to make testing easier, not like a brain probe. I've had a test. It's fun is not necessarily the word I would use, and I don't know if we'll ever get it to fun, but some improvements would be nice, and we'll talk about that. Treatment, what works and what doesn't, the immunity picture, and then vaccines. You know, we recently had, actually today, some good news from Dr. Anthony Fauci saying that it's a matter of when, not if, on these vaccines. I'm going to show you where we currently are in that vaccine development timeline, so you know kind of when to expect semi-normalcy, so to speak. So we'll talk about all that. The introduction, like I said, it was 10% too nice. But yeah, I started at Waterford School down in Sandy, then went to Westminster College, graduated there with a math degree. And then I actually worked in real estate for a couple of years and just started blogging in my spare time about the Utah Jazz. I grew up a Jazz fan. I loved basketball, loved the Jazz growing up, and started writing about the team on the side. Eventually, I was hired by KSL.com in 2014 to actually cover the Jazz full-time for them. And then I was hired by the Tribune 2 years ago in July of 2018. And then that's what I do. You know, I basically, during normal times, go around to Jazz games, home and away, cover them, write game stories, and typically have covered them from a pretty analytical perspective, given my math And then kind of everything changed that one night in Oklahoma City, March 11th. I was there in Oklahoma City when Rudy Gobert tested positive, and the NBA canceled their season. And I was one of these people in the locker room getting tested for the coronavirus because I had had significant exposure to Rudy Gobert. This smile, I think you can tell from the smile that it is not a real authentic smile. There's some real grimace to this, but this is me getting tested in the locker room there. And really, since then, the Tribune has has changed me into a coronavirus reporter. Given the lack of sports, given my data background, they thought, hey, you can kind of dig into the numbers here, the science, the analytics of what's happening with coronavirus in the United States, and in particular in Utah, and deliver that information to our readers. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been enormously shocked and surprised at how well the articles have been received. I was retweeted by like Jim Cramer, the CNBC Mad Money guy. I was retweeted by like multiple U.S. representatives. You know, it just, and kind of some of the nice words I've heard from people in the community about the coverage is something that I've did not expect. So I really appreciate the support there. But again, you guys don't care about me. You care about what's going on. So let's get into that. This is probably a graph you've seen if you care about the coronavirus. It is our current rate of transmission. This is our current case count since March 16th through today. As you can see, we've got kind of these waves going up and up. That's what you've heard about in the news recently. And this is tracking it in incidents per 100,000 people. So, you know, when we had 600 cases, as we did at this peak, that ended up being about 20 cases per 100,000 people. As you can see, it's increasing. This is probably not a surprise to you if you're on this call. Let me pull up the chat really. Okay. Salt Lake County, you can see, has maybe a similar rise in cases. Again, especially 2 to 3 days ago, we saw our peak. It's maybe not quite as, you know, it's a little bit flatter than the Utah graph overall is, but still we're seeing significant growth in Salt Lake County. What I thought was interesting, and I didn't break it down by Salt Lake City or individual cities within Salt Lake County. Most of the growth is coming in our west and south side at this point. So some cities that have seen significant growth include West Valley City, Kearns, Magna, and Sandy are some of the ones that we've seen really, really big growth in over the last week or two, as we have seen this growth in Salt Lake County. And then, of course, it's not just cases that we care about. We also want to be tracking hospitalizations, because this is kind of the metric to watch in terms of whether or not our hospital system is being overrun by the number of cases so far. And again, we have seen significant growth in the last 2 weeks, going from about 110 cases currently in the hospital as of June 7th to about 160, 170 as of the last couple of days. So right now we have just over 60% of our ICU beds filled in the state of Utah. That's something that is projected to increase as these cases filter into the hospital. And as you may have seen reported by Angela Dunn in her memo to state officials, what was that, this week? I can't even keep track of days anymore. But she said, you know, according to our hospital officials, we could see full hospitals max capacity within the next 4 to 8 weeks if this trend were to continue. So this is something that we really do need to keep an eye on, because, you know, obviously each case of coronavirus is bad enough in itself. It means ongoing cases. It means the risk of death. It means the risk of severe illness. It means real human suffering, which is not what we want. But certainly when hospitals become full, we see a real, it becomes worse for everyone, even who doesn't have the coronavirus, right? We see real suffering in terms of even those who need standard medical attention, and greater death rates and fatality rates and those kind of things. So this is definitely a stat to watch along with the case count. But that's, again, if you need more information on the current status, I really do recommend the state coronavirus website. They do a great job with it, coronavirus.utah.gov. And then there's a big case counts there button right in the middle of the page that allows you to track the latest stats. And they break it down by age, by demographics, by location. You can even find it for your kind of local zip code in a lot of places. It really does have good information on what's going on with the coronavirus in your specific part of the community. So check it out for kind of very specific information. We also just cover the coronavirus and what's happening with it on a day-to-day basis extremely well at the Salt Lake Tribune. So check those articles and news reports, even if it's not from the Trib, from anywhere. I think news media is actually doing a really good job in kind of keeping people apprised of the growth. But what I really want to get into is kind of how the coronavirus works, how to avoid it, what to expect moving forward, and those kind of things. And so that's where we get into the transmission, immunity, vaccines, testing, and treatment kind of conversations that we had in the table of contents earlier. So, and I think there's been a lot of reporting on certain scenarios, right? The cruise ships that really started this whole thing out, the jails, the homeless shelters, where we've seen huge numbers of cases, even locally. Meat processing plants like the one up in Hiram, Utah, that saw hundreds of cases. But I do think there's this lack of reporting sometimes on the parts of our lives that kind of everyday people visit pretty frequently, whether that's restaurants or grocery stores, some family settings, outdoors. I noticed you guys all have terrific backyard patios, and I'm very jealous of that. So I wanted to share some of the things we've learned of the studies in those kind of scenarios, and quite frankly, where there hasn't been transmission as well. So you know where there's kind of it's safe to be, and where you should avoid going if you're a high risk individual. So let's get into those scenarios. This one is a restaurant, and let me pull up my notes on this as well, because I obviously want to get the details right on this. Sorry, 1 second. Had it on my phone. All right, so this is a Chinese family from Wuhan that went to Guangzhou. This is a restaurant in Guangzhou that saw an outbreak of the coronavirus. And this woman, A1 here at the top of your screen, was the index patient. She was the first one to show symptoms. And that family, all seated in this middle table, table A, traveled from Wuhan to Guangzhou on January 23rd, I believe. Yes. And then so they had lunch at this restaurant. It was at the third floor of this restaurant. There wasn't a lot of ventilation. And they overlapped with these tables that they were next to, with table B for 53 minutes and with table C for 73 minutes. So they had a reasonably long lunch in kind of the same place. The red circles you can see on this map are people who got coronavirus and the dates in which they first showed symptoms. So you can see that the initial woman, A1, got symptoms far before everyone else, which is why researchers believe that she was kind of the index patient in this restaurant. And then she spread it to people in the person to her right and the person to that person's right. Got it in the same lunch scenario. There wasn't any contact after that with this, in between this family, along with a person, 2 people across the table from them. And then two people at the table kind of furthest from the index patient, and then 3 people in the table closest to the index patient. What's kind of interesting is that C1 and C2, these people who did contract the disease, were further than 6 feet away from the index patient here, A1. And actually, I think B1 was just barely 6 feet away as well. And so what they found was that or what they hypothesized, right? We really don't know for sure what's going on, but this is kind of the researchers' best guess, is that the air conditioner in this restaurant actually caused air currents to circulate in kind of a horizontal way back and forth between tables A, B, and C. And so what we see is the droplets that this woman, spoke. I should mention, by the way, that she was pre-symptomatic. She didn't have any symptoms at the time of this meal. And so, basically, these droplets, from her speaking, were transferred via the air conditioner to table B, table C, and some, but not all, of the participants or of the diners who sat at those tables. They didn't transfer to anyone at table D, E, or F, which is kind of interesting because there was, again, this kind of circulation that only went horizontally. But it kind of gives you an idea that, okay, the 6 feet social distancing isn't necessarily 100% effective all the time to prevent the spread in indoor places where there are other ventilation scenarios at play. This is a mall in, I believe it's Wenzhou. Let me, and I apologize if I'm butchering Chinese place names, by the way. I should really know more about how to say Wenzhou, I believe it is. And again, let me pull up the details on this one. Yeah, it is Wenzhou. So we had 34 infections here at this mall. And you can see this is the bottom axis here is kind of the dates in which how this unfolded. And so what happened is these people who work on the 7th floor of this mall all are in kind of an internal office situation where they're all sharing an office. They kind of run the mall, right? And so these 7 people up here got it on the 7th floor. They work in the same office. And then these are their family members who spread it as part of this cluster, who didn't work at the mall, never went to the mall, et cetera. They were just household contacts of the people who worked there. Then later, you can see for this patient A got it on January 15th. Then it started to spread through the rest of the mall. And you see it started first on this floor B1, then kind of a couple isolated cases on a couple of other floors here. And then really customers started to get it on the C floor throughout the next week or two, right? So you've got about 10 cases here. So what's interesting about this is that these cases, besides the ones that were on the 7th floor, all denied knowing or seeing one another or even going to some of the same places. And so what the researchers hypothesized here was that it was being spread in kind of in a fomite, in a surface sort of way, so that there was whether it be a elevator button or a shared drinking fountain. What's interesting is that a majority of these patients here were actually female, and so what they again, these are hypotheses, but maybe it was something in this mall's women's bathroom that caused the spread. One of these cases actually was a restroom cleaner who got it, who cleaned that female bathroom. So we don't exactly know, again, what happened here. We're making a lot of inferences based on how the disease spread and what people are reporting about seeing and not seeing each other. But of the tens of thousands of people who visited the mall, there wasn't widespread spread of the virus here. We did see it in these, about 34 cases here at this mall. All right, this office scenario is a good one. I guess it's not a good one. It's a bad one, whatever. So South Korea, I should start out, is incredible at contact tracing, is when someone gets the virus, figuring out who they've spread it to, where they've got it from, etc. So what they found, the South Korean officials found that there was an outbreak, 2 or more cases in an office building in downtown Seoul. And so what they did was tested literally everyone in this 19-story building. The first 11 floors of this mall are commercial. It's just commercial real estate, offices, etc. And then there are residents and apartments on floors 12 through 19. And so that means they test 1,145 people, including 811 people who work at this call center, which is on floors 7 through 9, I believe, of this building. What they found was 100 let's see. So of these 1,145 people, 97 of them tested positive. So 97 out of the 1,145, 94 of the 97 people all worked on the 9th floor of this call center. And you can see the seats that they sat at where they worked at are in blue. This is where the infections occurred. So you can see they were really limited to one side of this call center. In fact, 89 of the 94 people were on this one side of the call center. You did have scattered cases down here with people who may have shared facilities like the bathrooms, like the elevators, the lobby, etc. But for the most part, this is spread that was happening on one side. And so again, researchers hypothesize that okay, so first of all, it does seem transmission happens, again, more clearly in cases where people are speaking constantly, where they're sharing a lot of time with an infected person, and maybe not so much in cases where they're sharing facilities like a toilet or an elevator. It's certainly possible, and if you were a high-risk person, you wouldn't want to work on the south side of this floor either. But the super spreading events happen on the north side here, where you did see more infected patients because again there was all this talking. So again, kind of giving us an idea of how office scenarios work and what kind of things to really avoid as we look to avoid super spreading events of this disease. This graph is from the Gangelt, Germany Carnival. And I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. They do this annual carnival. It's something like Mardi Gras in Germany. And these are it's about a town of 3,000 people, Gangelt is. And hundreds of them went to this indoor tent where they do the festival with a lot of singing and dancing and that kind of thing. And what they found was naturally the people who went to the carnival had a higher infection rate than those who didn't. You could see about 23% of people who went to the carnival ended up with the disease, and when they did antibody studies about a month later, whereas only 9% of the people who didn't go to the carnival had the disease. What's really interesting, though, is not only that the people who went to the carnival were they more likely to get it, but they also had more symptoms. And so this is what's kind of what we're trying to figure out here, and we're doing more research that points in this direction. But if you are in a super spreading, high viral load kind of event where there's a lot of virus around you, there are a lot of people who are likely to get it, your disease might be worse as well as a result. That if you start with a high viral load, you have higher impacts on what happens to you when you get sick, compared to these people who got the virus but weren't at the carnival, who had a more mild illness. Now, we don't know for sure that's what's happening here, and again, this is just one town in Germany, but this is kind of a jumping off point for further research that we can definitely do. This one I don't have a fancy graph for, but I wish I did. This is an interesting one as I think about gyms and kind of similar workout scenarios that have opened up recently. So Zumba, I had no idea, is actually big in South Korea. And they had a 4-hour workshop for 27 Zumba teachers in South Korea in one localized city. 8 tested positive, and then they spread out of the Zumba workshop to teach their own Zumba classes elsewhere throughout the nation. 57 of those students were later infected, so that's a pretty high number, right? What's interesting is we can learn a lot about how the super spreading happens. So 2 of those teachers ended up creating like 45 of those 57 cases, and the others weren't as contagious. And again, we're kind of getting this continual trend of some people who have this are super spreaders, and some people who have this only end up giving it to 1 person, 2 people, maybe even nobody. And that's why we kind of see our contagion rate hover around 1, even though we have these crazy super spreading events. The other thing that was interesting about this gym scenario that I wanted to highlight was, so there's there's one of the teachers that's really contagious and taught yoga to this, taught Zumba to this class of 5 students. and I believe it was 3 of them who got infected, so an infection rate of 60%. Then the next hour after that Zumba class was done, a Pilates instructor who also tested positive taught in the same room with one of the and with about 25 students, and there wasn't any spread. 0 of their students got the coronavirus. So 2 hypotheses there, right? One, it could just be that the yoga instructor wasn't as contagious as the Zumba instructor. You know, we know that happens. Or it could be that Zumba, being a kind of a high intensity activity with a lot of breathing, a lot of sweat, all that movement, is more likely to spread the virus than kind of the more calm and you know, you guys know what yoga is. You're breathing more carefully and calmly during the whole exercise, and so there may be less of the virus kind of dispersed by breathing and those kind of things. So just something to watch for moving forward. Now I know one of you had a question about schools, and luckily I have the slide on schools here. So I wanted to answer the schools question, but I have to admit that right now we're still really gathering evidence on what the impact is of coronavirus in schools. But here are a couple of studies that I found really relevant. There was this one recent study that was highlighted in the Washington Post that found that 35 to 60%, children were 35 to 60% less susceptible to infection than adults 20 and over. If you look at the antibody studies that have been done in places like Spain and Iceland, you do see children are getting it, but clearly at lesser rates than their adult counterparts. And again, this is what the study found. The study of 15 Australian schools was a relatively recent one. There were 863 people who had come into close contact with an infected student, and that means contact within 6 feet for over 15 minutes. And they only found 2 cases of these 863 people who had come into contact with that student. Now, there were some social distancing measures taken, but kids are weird, kids are kids, and so maybe this wasn't necessarily the best scenario to study in terms of what normal school would look like, right? But it's again something that points in a direction. There's this other study that I thought had an interesting approach to it and said, okay, we're going to try to figure out where these cases are coming from within a household. Who is patient 0 in a house? And then figure out, you know, kind of what measures we can take in our society to stop transmission from getting into houses in the first place. So they looked at bird flu transmission, H5N1 transmission, and found 54% of them had a child as patient 0. In fact, that's a similar percentage that we see for diseases like influenza, where it's about 45, 50% of households that end up having a flu case are due to a child in the household who got it likely from school. When we do that with coronavirus, we only find that 9.7% of cases, of household cases, are from children, with households that have children as patient 0. So we're seeing, not only are we seeing lesser susceptibility to the coronavirus, we're also seeing lesser transmission from children as well. Now, there's this huge caveat here that, hey, schools haven't really been open. So, and in the places that they have been, people have been pretty careful about stuff. So we don't really know if this is for real or if this is just kind of a red herring in terms of what's going on with children. But what we really wish we had is kind of a mechanism here that would explain why schools were why these results were happening, right? And we don't have the scientific mechanism that explains, hey, this is why this is better for kids than it is for adults. And so until then, like I personally feel, I feel kind of torn in terms of, we have some relatively good evidence that schools are healthier or are less susceptible to spread than other places. But it's not good enough evidence to necessarily throw all of our children into the school system yet and say, hey, kids, go have a good time. So the good news is that we do have a bunch of studies coming that will happen before the school season starts, that will really shed more light on it. And in places that did keep schools open, like Sweden, the UK started to open up schools, and we should really get some better evidence on what's going on here. Um, Next slide. Do I have any questions, by the way? Oops. I don't believe so. Okay, cool. Back to the PowerPoint. All right. One other factor in transmission that I want to talk about is ventilation. And I think this is really key. It's just kind of like here's an everyday thing you can do to prevent the coronavirus from being spread. And really kind of some choices you can take in terms of what you're doing in terms of going to restaurants or going to stores and that kind of thing. This study looked at how long the coronavirus lasts, these aerosol particles last in the air, depending on different ventilation scenarios. So one, they just did a empty room with no ventilation. One was one where they put in just an air conditioning and nothing else. And that's our poor ventilation category in this slide. And then good ventilation was just that they opened up a small window. They actually didn't do a whole lot. They didn't there was just they opened up a window. And you can see the amount of virus quickly decreases when you've got that window open. You know, it goes, the virus essentially goes entirely away within 4 minutes and has a half-life of about 30 seconds. But when you don't have any windows open at all, you have no air conditioning, then that virus lasts a lot longer, up into the 30 minutes, hour and a half scenario. And you can see that the half-life is a lot longer, about 5.3 minutes. That AC makes it a little bit better, about a minute and a half in terms of half-life. The virus lasts about 12, 13 minutes, but it kind of gives you an idea of like, okay, what are the places that we need to avoid in terms of how I'm living my everyday life. So, you know, if I'm going to a store to buy something, you know, I want to make that either a quick trip or maybe a store, and maybe I want to go to stores with big ventilation. If I'm going to a restaurant right now, maybe you sit in the table next to the window rather than the one that's in the back of the restaurant. If you're a restaurant owner, you set up your tables so that you do have ventilation throughout the restaurant. Those kind of things. And certainly we can take some of those steps in our houses as well. Some other quick lists of spread and non-spread, and really I welcome, if you're curious about any of these places, to check out some of my reporting in the Salt Lake Tribune, because I have gotten studies in each of these cases that clearly we kind of know what's dangerous and what's not that dangerous. So you know, we've heard about the spread in bars and clubs. Clearly, over and over again, those have been places of high spread. Buses, choirs. You guys have probably heard about the Washington State choir that spread the disease in a significant way. 53 out of 61 choir attendees got the disease after 2.5-hour practice. Churches have been in a clear dangerous place of spread. Conferences, business conferences, family gatherings, ski resorts, sports, weddings have all been kind of the site of big super spreading events. What haven't been as bad are you know, we haven't seen huge amounts of spread in bathrooms. Clearly it's possible, but bathrooms have not been super spreading locations for the most part. Grocery stores, outdoors, we have seen very limited transmission. Polling places, Wisconsin had their primary election, and they did a good job of social distancing, but there wasn't the feared increase in cases up there. And then, like we talked about with schools. So I thought this Japanese, this piece of messaging by their Ministry of Health was really, really good, and kind of gives more detail than our kind of 6 feet mantra here in the United States. And they call it the 3 C's. They call it, the 3 C's are the closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact settings. And those are the things that we can all take steps to avoid in order to have the virus not be spread in our everyday lives. So again, closed spaces with poor ventilation, crowded places with many people nearby, and close contact settings, such as close range conversations. So if you can avoid places with any of those 3 C's, and then especially where those 3 C's overlap, you'll be in pretty good shape. All right, if you have any transmission questions, feel free to ask me. Put them in the chat or chime in. But for now, let's go into testing. So yeah, go ahead.
Just going back to some of the dangerous, non-dangerous spaces, I really love the fact that Angela Dunn shared your story, talking about the 3 Cs, saying that it was a really good way to think about risk when you go into environments. And particularly as a museum that's considering to open up, can you talk about like what your initial thinking is about reopening of museums? I know we have a few in Utah that have already opened.
Yeah, I think you basically want to think about the 3 Cs, not to, but if you can get ventilation in the Leonardo in the museum, I know I don't know how possible that is in that building, but certainly it's something to definitely consider. I would say limiting the number of people within the Leonardo at any given time makes a lot of sense, and to say, hey, this is something where we don't have close contact settings or with crowded, there isn't a crowd, so people really can maintain social distancing. I would kind of consider those as the big things. And then, obviously we've heard a lot about and talked a lot about mask usage in recent weeks, and that would be a big step I would take as well, is kind of preventing the spread that way with those face coverings.
I have a question along the lines. So I teach dance at Utah Valley University, and we are embracing the 3 Cs, as in we're doing all of them. So we've decided we've limited the rooms, the number of people that can be in a room. They're wearing masks. We're dividing the groups in half. So half will be at home, synchronously doing class, and then half will be in the classroom with me. Every one of our studios has a door, but when we've gone back and forth with this, we saw that information from the restaurant. So opening the door makes some of you more susceptible, makes everybody better. What would you do? The studios are probably, oh my gosh, they're big. They're 30 feet by 40 feet, and we're thinking of having 10 people, 10 people in a studio like that. But big, heavy breathing, and we are going to have marks on the floor, and it's just like, you just can't touch people. You just don't go over and correct a student. Don't touch a student. But yeah,
that's a hard one. And, I would say I certainly keep that door open. I understand kind of what you're thinking on the restaurant, but you do want the circulation in and out of the room so that you have kind of the air exchange. What you run into problems with air conditioning is when you see the recirculated air, where you get it from one place of the room and it's going to a different place, right? So, for example, I brought up buses as one of the dangerous places, where there was this bus group that had a significant super spreading event. They had their air conditioning on recirculation mode. So what you saw is the virus continually spreading. Okay. The door open should mitigate that somewhat and kind of make it more of a poor ventilation scenario rather than a no ventilation scenario, which is what you want.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And fans. Yeah.
And fan, honestly, I would also recommend fans, and be a little bit thoughtful about where you put the fans, so that you're not blowing air from one person onto the rest of the group, but maybe I've seen especially fans downward actually tend to have a huge impact in terms of getting those droplets to the ground quickly, rather than allowing them to spread from person to person. Now, I don't know how possible that is to put in like a ceiling fan or something like that, but it does seem to make a difference in terms of ventilation in these rooms. I noticed James Clark also asked about biking and walking in uncrowded areas without masks. In my semi-professional opinion, I'm not a doctor, to be clear. I think that is a low-risk activity. That's definition. If you are biking and walking where you're 6 feet away from people, especially outdoors where UV light is killing the virus very quickly, under a minute, you're as safe as can be. And so I have no problem whatsoever with you biking and walking in an uncrowded area without a mask. Even if you jog by someone, that's a very low risk scenario. In terms of, there's a study that looked at over 1,000 transmissions in China, and they try to find out where they all happened, right? Only one of them happened outdoors, and it was an outdoor conversation with a handshake and a hug at the end. And it happened outside a mall where there was an outbreak, not that one, but another one. And it kind of gives you a sense that, like, okay, the outdoor transmission of this thing is very rare. So, I certainly, in terms of what I do in my everyday life, I walk around outdoors without a mask, without feeling guilty or concerned about it. Anyway, thank you for the questions. Let's go into testing real quick. Normal tests look like this, and this is what I had done to me in Oklahoma City. It's weird. It's a little bit like having really spicy hot sauce and that kind of like nasal sinus clearing feeling in your brain. I've never been touched this far back in my head, I feel like, but it wasn't that bad. It took about 5 minutes. It was a really quick thing. But I do think that this kind of picture scares some people. And so what we've found is that, first of all, testing has not increased since about mid-April in the state of Utah. It stayed very flat, and in some cases has even decreased during kind of the May, June doldrums, if you will. So that's something to be aware of. We've got our negative tests here in gray, positive tests in blue. Our positive test rate has gone up as well from April to now. We're now seeing 7 to 10% of people are testing positive in some of our worst days. But I also just think we can make testing easier so that we can get a better idea of tracking this thing. So first, saliva tests have actually shown to be just as and maybe more effective as the swab up your nose tests, which is something that we're basically, epidemiologists are used to using swab up your nose tests because they work better for influenza and a couple of other viruses where you have kind of lower there's more virus in the lower respiratory tract or higher further back in your sinuses. With COVID, it's actually much higher in your respiratory tract, and so your saliva ends up having a higher concentration of the virus, and so the tests work just as well. We just have to kind of adapt our systems to work with the saliva rather than the swabs. The wastewater testing and large-scale efforts are underway. You may have seen that article in the Salt Lake Tribune about the results of the wastewater testing throughout Utah. That was a very successful project and gave us really the ability to know what's going on in the community before the test results come in. And so that's very exciting. We kind of can identify outbreaks before more quickly and send resources and get hospitals in that area ready and those kind of things. I also think we should just kind of change the economic picture with testing a little bit, where right now, a lot of people who work aren't getting time off for testing. There is a Smithfield meat processing plant in South Dakota that actually gave their employees a $500 quote unquote responsibility bonus if they showed up to work every day in April. Well, the problem is that meant people showed up to work sick, and that meant more spread of the virus. That's exactly what we don't want. So we need to be smart about giving people reasons to, if they're sick, to stay home rather than to come into work and spread the virus to everywhere else. But we need to make testing easier, better for the overall population in order to really spread this, in order to stop the spread. Let's talk about treatment. So treatment is something that has really, we've learned a lot more about how the virus works and therefore more about how to treat it in recent weeks and months. And this is a study from Harvard that basically proposed this 3-stage method of thinking about the coronavirus. And so what happens is you've got your viral response phase. And what happens is when you get the virus by inhaling it, right? You inhale these droplets, or you touch a surface with the virus, your hands touch your face, you get the virus that way, right? But it's in your respiratory tract. And basically the virus connects to one of your lung cells and injects itself into that cell and makes that cell into a copy machine that basically copies the virus and creates those viruses can then bounce around and to infect other cells. And you obviously have the ability then to sneeze or cough up more virus, and et cetera, et cetera. Your immune system realizes this, and so you have this early phase where your basic immune system is basically taking care of it. It's treating it like a more mild illness or like a cold or a flu, where you have a cough, you have a fever to try to kill the virus, you have a sore throat, you may have some other conditions like diarrhea, you may have a headache, chills, those kind of things, but kind of the normal way our immune system deals with infection. And for 80 to 90% of people, that's very effective. That's why we see most of the cases are mild. Some of them are even asymptomatic because the immune system works so well. What we see in a certain percentage of people, and it's really probably the majority of the remainder of those people, is that their immune system freaks out. And it's not exactly clear what causes the immune system to freak out, but this is what's represented here in this right triangle, this host inflammatory response phase triangle. And that's something called the cytokine storm. And that's when your immune system basically can't stop reacting and actually overreacts, is over exuberant about the disease here, and all sorts of bad and crazy stuff happens. So you get shortness of breath, you get the lack of respiratory ability. One of the things your immune system does naturally is makes your blood veins, your blood vessels kind of a little bit, I'm forgetting the word, that's where you can basically get the immune cells from the blood vessels to the infected cells more quickly. It's a little bit more permeable. When you have this extreme cytokine storm response, your blood vessels actually become too permeable and they actually spring leaks, which means that your body then has to clot those leaks in your blood vessels, and then all of a sudden now you've got micro blood clots throughout your body, which cause all sorts of other problems. This is where we get some of the cardiac failure symptoms that we've seen in COVID patients. And these were symptoms that we really didn't understand for a long time, because there was just, people are dying of COVID, but they're doing it through like having strokes, and they're having it through weird, other like kidney failure and heart failure. And it's not that they were having, they had COVID and just randomly also had a heart attack. It was clear that the COVID was causing the heart attack or was causing the stroke. So what we found out is that it's really the cytokine storm, this immune system overreaction, that is causing the huge problems in a lot of the patients that have severe illness or die of COVID-19. And that's what we see here in stage 3. So what that means is basically we have to treat it in different ways, depending on where you are in the stages of the virus. In stage 1, in the early infection, we want to help out your immune system as much as possible. That means antivirus medications. That means immune system boosting kind of things that really kind of make your immune system as good as possible. Then in the second phase, the cytokine storm phase, we want to hurt your immune system a little bit. We want to be like, hey, slow down here. Let's make this more mild. Let's stop hurting yourself, essentially. And that's really what we see during the cytokine storm. And so you need a separate set of treatments for that. So for that first stage, for that antiviral stage, we have remdesivir. And this was kind of the big breakthrough treatment that Dr. Anthony Fauci was so excited about late April, early May. That's kind of been the new standard of care that was immediately picked up by the FDA. So it's an antiviral drug that has to be injected intravenously over the course of 5 to 10 days. But the good news is that it has been scientifically studied by the National Institutes of Health in a very big study with a random controlled trial that had a statistically significant difference in terms of the time in hospital in severe cases. And then it also helped with mortality to some extent, but not such that it was statistically significant. One of the reasons it wasn't statistically significant was because they stopped the study early because it was helping people. So that's kind of a catch-22 for researchers, whether you stop the study and hurt more people maybe by not giving them remdesivir, or if you continue the study and have better evidence. And what these researchers decided was to give these people remdesivir who needed it in order to survive. This is kind of the beginning. It really is kind of like HIV, where you may need a real regimen of drugs in order to stop the virus. We're going to be building off the remdesivir base. We would like to know if earlier remdesivir would help more. We may want to find another antiviral that works. That'd be great. We may want to mix remdesivir with other treatments to make that work better. But this is kind of our beginning place in terms of treatment. Hydroxychloroquine is the one you've heard a gazillion things about. I'll just go over it briefly, but it's a drug that worked on malaria. So people are like, hey, maybe this will work here. And I get it, theoretically, it actually probably should work on COVID-19. But things that work theoretically or in test tubes or Petri dishes don't always work in real life. There was an early small French study that showed effectiveness. There was a since retracted huge American study that showed that it real harm, but that was from faulty data, it turns out. And then there have been literally just 150 studies on every aspect of remdesivir, or on hydroxychloroquine, from what it does mixed with azithromycin, what it does when mixed with zinc, when you do it at different stages, just observational things. It's crazy how many different studies there are. I would say the majority of them don't show what you would expect to see, even at like the remdesivir level of treatment, which is kind of a bummer. It'd be really nice if hydroxychloroquine worked. I would say, based on our current amount of evidence on these kind of sketchy, so many small studies, it probably doesn't. That would be my guess. But I really, I'm open to other evidence here that would show that it works. And I do actually think we should continue testing it. I don't think it's particularly dangerous, actually. I think we've done enough research on that to show that it's probably fine. The study that did show significant harm was, again, kind of rebuked. It was definitely retracted. That's evidence wasn't great. But I also don't think it does anything. And quite frankly, using the hydroxychloroquine samples instead of people giving them to people with lupus may not make sense either. So don't use it as a prophylaxis before you get it, or if you're worried about getting the coronavirus. I definitely say that. Just does look like I have a chat question. Oh, thank you. You're welcome. All right. Cytokine storm. So we talked about that. So we've got two different drugs that have shown effectiveness in stopping cytokine storm, but really we have some more ideas here that we really want to test out. Tocilizumab, I don't know how to pronounce that, but there was an initial trial that showed 45% lower possibility of death when given tocilizumab in cytokine storm situations. It was a small trial, but it was really effective, so that's good. It is a very expensive injected drug, so it's not something that you want to give to people. It really does kind of hurt your immune system for the next month. So if you do give it to someone, you have to give them all sorts of antibacterials to make sure that they're not getting another infection. But it works. So, if you have severe COVID, that it is something that you probably want to take. This recent study from the UK, from their quote-unquote recovery program, which is actually kind of brilliant. The UK is been one of my favorite countries to watch during this whole thing, because they basically threw the kitchen sink at COVID, and they were like, okay, we're just going to do trials on everything and see what works. One of them was this dexamethasone steroid that basically, again, makes the immune system response more mild. And it led to a 33% reduction in ICU visits when it was given to people in stage 2 of the disease. And it's much cheaper and like wildly something that we have a lot of. It's widely available, both wildly and widely available. $6 per day. This is the kind of treatment that we really would like. So you've got some good stuff there. You also probably want like anticoagulants so you don't get those blood clots, which can cause all sorts of problems. But now we know that. So if someone is in the cytokine storm phase, we can give them things so they're not having all these failures in other parts of their body once the circulatory system breaks down. But just like with phase 1 or stage 1, we need more study figure out what the most effective combination is to kind of tamper the cytokine storm and make it less harmful for people. Immunity, the immunity picture is relatively good. So nearly everyone who is infected with the coronavirus does get antibodies, which is very good news. Those antibodies do at least a decently good job, which is good news in terms of, you know, we haven't seen widespread reinfection. We haven't even seen really any confirmed cases of reinfection. We don't know, because this is a novel coronavirus, how long these antibodies last in terms of giving immunity out. You know, in mild coronaviruses, ones that just kind of cause common colds, we saw antibody levels drop off after a year, but people did seem to see more mild infections, more mild colds even after that. In kind of the more severe coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, where you saw like 20 to 40% fatality rates, the antibodies lasted a lot longer. So we're probably looking at antibody levels that last about that long, but you know, we're really guessing here. So because this is a brand new thing, we don't know anything about. So
Andy, I think back to the cytokine storm.
Yeah.
James, what about statins?
I don't know a lot about statins, and to be honest, I haven't done a lot of research on them. I'm just going to say an I don't know here and go with that. It's not something, you know, they're on my plate as something to look at, and I haven't done the full research on them. So in being cautious, I think it's probably best I don't say anything.
Makes sense.
Vaccine. So that's kind of the immunity picture, if anyone has questions on that. And I know I'm going through this relatively quick because now I'm over my hour, but I do want to talk about vaccines, and then of course answer any other questions that you guys have. So vaccine development, we're doing an awesome job on this in kind of an unprecedented way, right? So normal vaccine development is measured in literal decades. Like the HPV vaccine took decades to develop, the measles vaccine, you know, all these different vaccines that from modern to from the very beginning, it usually takes decades to develop them, because scientists get an idea, then it has to be tested in this multi-stage process I'll explain in a second, and that gets released to a community that is probably slow to pick them up to some degree. So it's also something that's usually pretty underfunded, because vaccines just don't make a ton of money in our current medical system. You know, like they're cheap drugs that you give to everyone once in their life, and they can't be that expensive because you want them to be given to low-income communities. And so there's just not a lot of money thrown at vaccine research all the time, especially in America, which is something that, you know, I personally think we should probably fix, is kind of have some of these earlier treatment or earlier vaccination options rather than having more severe disease later in life. But that's, I guess, as political soapbox as I'm going to get. And right now we just have so much money to throw in vaccines that it's just not a problem. So and Dr. Anthony Fauci has famously said this 12 to 18 month timeline. Today, again, he said, you know, it's a matter of when and not if on the vaccine, in terms of whether we get it late 2020 or early 2021. So again, that fits that 12 to 18 month timeline. Where are we now? First, just a quick thing on how vaccines work. Basically, your immune system's really cool, except when it's doing the cytokine storm. But if you give it information right away about a microorganism that it can use later, it's really, really good at fending those off. And so we give it information in a couple of different ways. You can either use what's called an inactivated vaccine, which takes some of the viruses that's been killed with heat or chemicals and just injects it into you. You can do a live attenuated vaccine, which just isolates a weak form of the virus and injects it into people, which is the measles vaccine. Then there are these kind of newer vaccine kinds that we're really working on developing, and really probably where the most promising coronavirus vaccines come from. The subunit vaccine, which actually takes part of the vaccine, part of the virus or the bacteria that the immune system will recognize, and combines it with something safe, like a standard common cold kind of thing, and combine and injects it into someone like that. So that's the HPV or the tetanus shots that we've been dealing with or we've had for the last couple of decades. And then these DNA and RNA vaccines are brand new, but they're very cool and potentially very kind of world-changing in vaccines, where you actually take the virus's DNA or RNA and inject it by itself, so that the immune system recognizes that code, and you don't have to kind of combine it with a virus or have a weakened form of the virus. It's just like, hey, here's the code you should watch out for. And that way we prevent the disease from spreading. Problem is we've got actually some animal case vaccines, DNA and RNA vaccines that have been approved, but we don't have any US approved human DNA and RNA vaccines yet. It's very possible that the coronavirus vaccine will be the first one of these. So they're tested kind of these three stages. There's kind of the preclinical stage where first someone gets a vaccine idea and then tested in a petri dish or in animals, usually ferrets, which I think is kind of funny, but also frequently in monkeys is kind of the last animal to be tested, because obviously the similarity from a genetic point of view to humans. And then we do phase 1. Is this vaccine basically safe? If you give it to dozens of people, do you see any symptoms? Do you see any side effects? Those kind of things. Phase 2, is this vaccine effective? When you give it to hundreds of people, do any of them get the disease that you're trying to prevent? And then phase 3 is kind of like the last step of like, okay, if we give this to large swaths of people, is everything going to be good? Is it safe and effective over the whole population? When you give it to old people, when you give it to people with high risk, when you give it to young people, when you give it to people from every walk of life, how does it work? And that's when we really have to test on thousands to tens of thousands of people. So here's where we currently stand in the vaccine pipeline. And you can see we've got a ton of them that we're working on right now. I believe it's 145 is where we're at right now. And 146 it looks like. So we've got a bunch of these that that we're really working on. You'll notice that the two up at the top are maybe vaccines that you've heard of before. And they're the BCG vaccine and the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And the reason that those are in phase 4 right now is, quite frankly, we know that those vaccines are safe. We know that they're effective at stopping measles, mumps, and rubella. And someone basically thought, hey, let's see if this works to stop the coronavirus too. It's a long shot, right? But long shots are probably worth doing in our current environment, where if we found a vaccine that works even to stop 20% of cases, it might be worth doing in kind of some high risk places like a hospital or wherever your high risk people are. So the BCG vaccine is kind of the same thing. Again, we haven't seen real effectiveness in terms of these things stopping the coronavirus, but we are further along in testing them because we know that they're safe at least. Then you see this whole swath of phase 1 and phase 2 vaccines that we're working on now, and these are all, again, human trials. And so a lot of these are doing combined phase 1s and phase 2s, where you basically do phase 1 on hundreds of people at a time, especially severe cases or people who are in high-risk scenarios. And we feel like that is a worthwhile trade-off because, again, our current state of affairs with coronavirus is as bad as it is, with, as 120,000 people dead in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So we have 18 of those vaccines in phase 1, 12 in phase 2, and there's one of kind of the ones that may have a case to really work, and that's this AZD 1222, which is one I'm going to be getting to in phase 3. So the first one I'll talk about is the Moderna vaccine. That one's it was in the headlines about 3 weeks ago, but they did have really good success in their really small phase 1. So first of all, they injected about 40 people, but only tested about 8 of them for antibodies. What they found was all 8 people studied that they did test for antibodies did have antibodies, which means that they inject the RNA vaccine, couple of weeks later, they check to see if if your immune system has developed the antibodies that make it work. And all of them did. Now, 8 is a very, very small sample size, but 100% is a very, very good success rate. The other good thing is that there were very, very minor side effects. I mean, nearly no one had side effects at all, and the ones that did had redness at the spot where they injected it in their arm, which is something that you get with a lot of vaccines. So that's not something that they're very worried about. They found the correct dosage that they wanted to do. They tested people at 3 different doses. They used kind of the medium one, and they're going to be doing that with phase 2 and phase 3, which is currently underway. Oxford, this is the AZD 1222 one that was currently in phase 3. It's a subunit vaccine, so it uses the chimpanzee form of the common cold with the current coronavirus spike protein. So basically, it would give you the common cold, but because we use a chimpanzee form of it, because this way no humans have actually had it, which means you can give it to more people, right? That you can give the vaccine to more people, not without their immune system fighting against it. So it prevents, and when they gave it to the monkeys, it prevented severe disease, but didn't prevent infection. It really infected these monkeys with a high quantity of the virus. Like, they really shoved the virus down their throats. So there's kind of some questions on whether or not it would infect people in a normal scenario, but that's something that we're really trying to find out in phases 2 or 3. The good news is phase 1 went really well from a safety point of view. There were nearly no side effects in anybody. So it's clear that the Oxford vaccine is safe and at least mildly effective at preventing severe disease, or at least preventing in monkeys. What we're trying to figure out is if it really prevents it in people, and that's what we'll learn in this combined phase 2 and phase 3 that's going on right now. Just some other vaccine candidates that are happening right now. The CanSino vaccine is from China. They're in phase 2 right now. It's actually, I think it's a phase 2, phase 3 combined. Kind of the question with any Chinese vaccine is whether or not the US would get quick doses of it, or if they would literally immunize all of China before they gave it to the US. And given that that's 1 billion people, that would be, that means delaying it by a few months here. That's something we don't really know yet. I like this Inovio vaccine, and I'm kind of rooting for it as like a small player that might work out. But they've got a really clever delivery method called a prickly patch, and it's about a fingertip big, but you actually just kind of put it on your skin like a nicotine patch, and it has all these kind of what are called microneedles that go into the first layer of your skin and actually deliver the vaccine that way. Which may make it easier to distribute to everyone, right? Instead of going to a doctor, you just kind of get a prickly patch in the mail and stick it on your arm for a couple of days. That would be a lot easier to immunize a whole population. So that's something to watch. The BioNTech and Pfizer group is working on 4 different RNA vaccines at once, and they're just going to see which one works best, which I think is a good approach. Obviously, they have a lot of money behind them, so that could be promising. And then China's Sinovac Picovac vaccine is a very old school vaccine, just an inactivated virus vaccine, but it did have encouraging results in monkeys. So another one to watch for moving forward. One last thing before we wrap up, and that's on antibody testing. So I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about antibody testing. Some of you may have even had one done. It's just a blood test to determine whether or not you currently have the antibodies to the virus. As you've probably heard, some of these tests are pretty inaccurate. There are about 3 that are kind of the gold standard in the US that have success rates of 99% and above. And the rest are somewhere below that, whether that's 60%, 70%, or 98%. There are just kind of a huge swath of antibody tests right now out there on the market. So if you are going to get one of these, make sure you know which test was used and research it. The ARUP test, that local lab in Utah's test, they say they have a 98.4% rate, which is pretty good. the problem is, even when you have a test that is pretty accurate, like that 98.4% one, when you have 1.6% of false positives, that means when you have a community that's, let's say, 2 to 5% of Utah has had the coronavirus, your odds of having a false positive in that context are very high. So if we say 3% of Utah has had the coronavirus so far and 1.5% of people are getting false positives, that means for any individual that's taking the test, there's about a 33% chance, a 1/3 chance that that positive isn't because you had the coronavirus before, but is instead a false positive that you had from your actually relatively good test. And so what that means is that antibody testing, if you're doing it as an individual, I'd really be sure that you're kind of taking one of the gold standard tests. And if not, I wouldn't go out and, even if you test positive for the antibodies, go out and do dangerous things, go to bars and hang out in call centers and meat processing plants, right? Like, it's not a get out of jail free card necessarily, because there is a really high risk of a positive test. Obviously, this is something that we're clamping down on. The FDA is removing some of these authorizations for the worst tests, but is still something that I would definitely research. The good news is even though these tests are iffy on the individual level, when you do thousands and thousands of them, we can really understand what's going on with the virus's spread, what its infection fatality rate is, how many people in Utah have gotten it so far, and those kind of things. And those can be really helpful in terms of identifying which communities, again, need more resources, more support, where to put hospital beds, that kind of thing. So it can be tremendously useful in that way. So that's what I have on antibody testing. And I think that's what I have for my whole presentation. James R. Clark, I saw asked about what about blood type influence on the virus. And I bet James is referring to that recent study that showed that there was a difference in kind of whether or not people with A blood type versus O blood type had the virus, or were susceptible to the virus, I should say. I believe, and I'm trying to remember if I got this right. That's right. So it's type O blood that is 35%, had a 35% protective effect. So if you have type O blood, you are less susceptible to getting the virus. If you have type A blood, you're slightly more susceptible to getting the virus than the overall average. Now, 35%, you can decide whether that's a lot or not a lot, but it does seem that having a different blood type does have some sort of protective effect on disease severity. So that's a good point. I see someone else raising their hand. It's not showing me names. Oh, that is James raising his hand. Cool, okay.
Hey, Andy, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, hi.
Congratulations on your work. Many of us think it is the best in the country. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you.
Please don't go back to the Jazz.
I'll address that real quick. Like, this is something that I was talking to our publisher today, Jennifer Napier-Pierce, our head editor. We're trying to figure out what that's going to look like, but I definitely will be doing non-Jazz stuff moving forward. It may be both.
That's exciting. I thought I was kidding.
But I will do a little bit of both. Yeah, there will be some in both categories at least.
Well, that's excellent. My question is this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the math of testing. We hear that more testing is important to get a hold of this virus, but in my mind, the only way that testing would work would be massive portions of the population very regularly. Can you talk about the efficacy of the sort of testing that we are doing? And my other question is, would you, Andy Larsen, have elective surgery in Utah today?
My second question is, the answer to my second question is yes, I would. And that's because, I think hospitals are doing a very good job of preventing the spread of the virus and preventing, kind of those complications. I think in 4 to 8 weeks, when we have full hospitals and all of a sudden you're taking resources from those hospitals that need them for, more immediate things, my answer to that question might be different. But today, I feel safe and good about doing an elective surgery. As for your first question, testing, I would say, first of all, the kind of standard testing allows us to start the contact tracing process is really kind of the most important thing in my mind that it does. Is when someone tests positive, that person then can quarantine, and we can watch their immediate contacts for symptoms. So we know, hopefully before something like the Hiram meat processing plant happens, that we can say, hey, these people can stay home from work. And when we have a liquor store that we have an employee who tests positive, we close that liquor store down and we clean it up so that customers aren't likely to be infected moving forward. And I think it's those kind of individual steps that we can take with testing that actually do make a big difference in terms of what we see in the effective contagion rate, how frequently the disease is transmitted from person to person. As for like wastewater testing, antibody testing, kind of the community testing things overall, I think it really teaches us it teaches us kind of in generalities. I thought that the wastewater testing that showed that there would be an outbreak up in Hiram even before it happened was really promising, and as a kind of a proof of concept for what that testing can do. And then, once we get kind of the numbers of regular tests that we need, we can send, those PCR tests to those standard coronavirus tests to that community, and kind of do, quite frankly, better and quicker testing in those areas, kind of high priority testing. So then we can, again, do the contact tracing steps from there. So it's all kind of a landslide, and it means that each step has to work in order for us to really stop the spread in significant ways. And certainly we haven't seen total effectiveness at every step. I think we should continue to work towards that in order to kind of reduce that effective contagion rate as much as possible.
Okay, I have just your best guess on this test.
Okay.
So there's some clarity that elderly people with underlying conditions, they have worse outcomes. And then there's this big group of people that, it's relatively minor. But there is that cohort, young, marathon runners that, my God, they're on a ventilator. Is there any indication, any effort being made? Like, why do some people inexplicably do so poorly with it?
Clearly, it's those people are getting the cytokine storm. Now, what triggers the cytokine storm is really interesting. So, and something that we don't know a lot about. There are those that it's clear that sometimes the cytokine storm is triggered when the immune system sees that, I'm not working well enough. I need to kind of turn the dial to 11 on this thing, right? And that really triggers it. For some people, and we don't know why, the marathon runners, the healthy 30-year-olds that are dying out of nowhere, for some reason the cytokine storm gets triggered anyway. And we quite frankly just don't understand why that's happening. There are a couple hypothesis things about maybe whether or not they've been infected with a similar virus before. There's quite frankly just a question of whether or not they have an immune system deficiency or something broken that we don't understand about that person yet, or don't have time to figure out about them before their coronavirus symptoms become the severe issue. It's really kind of a ongoing focus for us, that there's kind of that Kawasaki disease in children that made a lot of headlines about a month ago, where you saw some of the blood symptoms I was talking about. And again, that seems to be a cytokine storm thing that's happening even in children. And We don't understand that's happening very, very rarely in those kids, but enough of people got it, and enough children got it in New York City that their health department issued that statement. So I think it's something to watch for in terms of our ongoing study. But one of the big things I've learned through this whole process is how little we know about infectious diseases overall. It's funny. This isn't relevant to your question, but just like with the face masks, we've done nearly no studies on face masks when it has with regards to like influenza, and we've done nearly no studies on viral transmission when it comes to like common colds, that we really just don't understand how the antibodies work very well in normal situations. So that we're trying to figure it out in terms of this new disease, we're really starting from square one in a lot of these cases, and certainly the cytokine storm is one of them that we're starting near the beginning. If anything, it's really made it clear the importance of scientific research and kind of putting resources to that in ways I definitely expected us to be kind of further along on some of these issues than we were. And it's really just kind of been fascinating to see. The good news is, I guess, moving forward, is that we will have a much better understanding of how even things like influenza, the bird flu, all that kind of stuff spreads moving forward, which is good. And the cytokine storm, for example, is triggered by a whole bunch of different things. So like severe burn victims face the cytokine storm after the shock that they experience. What can you do with those people is probably going to be informed by our approach to COVID-19.
Hey, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
So I have a ticket to go to Fan X in September, and they always get like 60,000 people there.
Yeah.
And I think they plan on going forward with that. And looking at your list of the 3 C's, I don't really see how that's possible in September. I've heard them talk about, well, maybe we'll wear masks. But if you're walking, so you can only walk like 3 inches at a step because you're all crammed in with a bunch of people, I really don't see how that's possible to even have something that large at the Salt Palace. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, my thought is that that's a bad idea. I'll just being straightforward, that's a bad idea and shouldn't be allowed to continue. And honestly, the analogous situation that I've looked a lot at is sports, and whether or not sports with tens of thousands of people in Vivint Arena can happen, right? Obviously, I'd like that to return, but it doesn't make sense under any realistic circumstance with or without masks. It's just not a smart thing to do.
Mm-mm. And my second question is, do you think the numbers going up has something to do with the riots and protests? I went to a protest and they said everybody has to have masks, and they walked around giving masks, and they made everybody keep backing up, and it seemed pretty safe to me. But some of the ones that they've had on TV, they haven't had masks, or they haven't been, they're all crammed together. And I just wonder if the numbers are going up a lot because of that too.
Yeah, it's something to consider for sure. So you've got a bunch of like positive and negative factors when it comes to masks, right? You've got when it comes to protests, you've got the mask wearing, which is usually better than kind of normal society, I think, is what I've seen, and kind of in honestly just judging from pictures and from a couple of first person things. But you've got that people are outdoors, which means you've got really good ventilation, and you've got that it's sunny, and then you've got UV light that's killing the virus more quickly. But on the downside, you've got really big crowds and a lot of shouting, right? You've got a lot of chanting, a lot of virus emitting things, right? I would say we really don't have an idea. We're sitting here 3 weeks from the start of these protests, and we do see that increase in cases, right? But we're only seeing in parts of America, so we're not seeing it in certain places where there were huge protests, like Philadelphia, for example, massive protests, hasn't seen the increase in cases that we have seen in Utah, Arizona, and other places. The other thing I've been looking at is kind of the Salt Lake City growth versus the growth in other parts of the county. And again, the Salt Lake City growth has been somewhat more flat than other places in Salt Lake County. This is me taking kind of 3 steps there and saying people who lived in Salt Lake City, whether for political reasons or just because they were closer to the protests, were more likely to attend the protests, and therefore if protests were a major super spreading case, we would see it in Salt Lake City data in particular. We haven't seen that so far. Certainly we do have multiple cases from the health department that were likely from protest spread, so it can happen. But it's a really interesting question that, quite frankly, we just don't have a ton of data on right now in either direction, and it's something I'm watching really carefully. Hopefully that helped. I know that was kind of a non-answer, but our best guess is at least, my best guess is at least some. I don't think we've seen exploding super spreading cases like many here.
Well, thank you so much. Such great information.
Thank you.
And since we're just about at time, I want to thank you again, Andy, so much for joining us. Audrey and Fred said, we think you're great, excellent analysis. James said, thanks so much, excellent presentation. I couldn't agree more. I also wanted to mention, for those that are here and who might see it later, it's worth mentioning that the Salt Lake Tribune is providing free access to critical stories about the coronavirus, including all of Andy's coverage. The Salt Lake Tribune is a nonprofit, so really counts on support. If you don't have a subscription to the Tribune, if there's anything that you can donate to help keep Andy's coverage going, that would be great. And for those of you who joined us tonight, I know that we had to reschedule because we wanted to make sure that people could go to the series of Trib Talks, the town halls talking about social justice and some of the factors within Utah. So that is going on again tomorrow night. I hope that you'll be able to join if it's something that interests you. And again, Andy, thank you so much for joining us. It was such a delight to have you.
I have a quick question for you on the Leonardo. What can we do to help? So, you know, we have a membership. What else can we do to help support our wonderful museums and arts organizations? You know.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, arts organizations are critical. They're lifeblood to Salt Lake City. And so anything that you can do to support monetarily to any of the cultural institutions in Utah is helpful. That goes for the Leonardo. Any donations that are given through our website are tax deductible. If you want to encourage others to join and get a membership, that's another way that you can support us. We're currently in discussions about the timing of opening the museum. We do have summer camps that are running right now that are in person on site at the museum for a very limited number of people. So if you know people with kids who are looking for options for them over the summer, we have an excellent summer camp program. But yeah, keep letting us know what are the sorts of things that you want to see. We're reimagining what it looks like to be a member of the Leonardo. We're hoping to bring more discussions and salon type discussions to our members, similar to this. And so Andy's kind of a kickoff to something that we're testing out to see how we can look at intersectionality among a number of issues. So if you know people are interested in like-minded conversations, please send them our way.
And Andy, you will be getting an email from me and Utah Valley University. I seriously think that you need to do this presentation for the School of the Arts, because we are a wing and a prayer, man, trying to figure this thing out. and it, you know, you have some very good information, hard information, but also if we're going to move forward, what are the things that we could do to move forward? We're in the same position that the Leonardo is. You know, you can't just close a department. Right. So what are we going to do? How are we going to make this safe for students? How are we going to make this effective so that our curriculum is still good? They're not just wasting, a semester. Yeah. So yeah, I am a lot to think about, but I'm really excited about it. And honestly, Leonardo, we're definitely, if there's any way we can do things with classes, working with you guys together, You know, we just have to. I used to dance with RDT. We just cannot let these. You know, we can't lose all these great organizations because of this damn virus. No, we just can't. So whatever we got to do, we got to do it.
I'm happy to talk to you more in depth, Angie, and I'm going to connect you with Brooke Horsch as well.
Okay, great. I'll get back with you. And Andy, really, truly, the information is encouraging. Hard to take, but encouraging. So yeah. I will definitely, if I just go online at the Trib, I can find your email, right?
Yeah, it's just alarsen@sltrib.com.
Okay. I can't wait to talk to you again.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.